Is Warcry competitive? That's a question we often get, and the answer is yes. But not everyone agrees, and that's with good reason. For some people, Warcry is a fun beer and pretzels game. The reality, of course, is it can be both. In this video, I'm going to talk about competitive play in Warcry, specifically looking at the tournament formats currently used, and how they could be improved. From day one, Warcry came with a fantastic scenario generation system using random cards to determine terrain, victory conditions, deployment, and a fun little twist. This kept games interesting and quick to put together, but it also resulted in some games which were decided before they were even started. You can play those games to win, taking every advantage you can and being absolutely ruthless, but the level of randomness in the setup diminishes the contributions of pre-planning and tactical play on the board. This is why this type of format is considered casual. If you want to play Warcry competitively, you need to take a different approach. We want to keep the starting field as level as possible so the game is a decent test of skill rather than pure luck. One approach is to only use the scenario cards with the match play symbol. A more extreme approach is to use pre-made scenarios where we completely remove the random generation. These are the scenarios from the back of the rules PDF, Ley Lines and Reaper. Let's imagine a competitive scene where we only ever play these two scenarios and nothing else. Ley Lines is an objective-based scenario, while Reaper is about having the most points worth of kills each turn. In Ley Lines, you're probably going to do better with a chaff warband, where you have lots of fighters able to control as many of the objectives as possible. In this scenario, 2 skeletons on an objective is better than 1 Stormcast. In Reaper, things are reversed. You want to get kills each turn, and even though the skeletons are cheap, your 1 Stormcast is going to get you more victory points each turn. Another aspect is deployment. In both scenarios, the dagger starts the game in play, with the shield arriving in turn 2 for Ley Lines, while in Reaper it's the hammer. If we put our best fighters in our shield group and end up playing Ley Lines, we'd be at a disadvantage. So these scenarios aren't fair, but going into them we know what to expect. We get to craft our warbands and tailor them to the scenarios as best we can. When we start the battle, the deployment and victory conditions are mirrored, so that battle will be decided based on our choices before the battle, our tactics in the battle, and to a certain extent, the random chance based on dice. That's what makes it competitive. In this competitive scene, certain factions would rise to the top and others would fall behind. We'd see YouTube videos with tier lists weighing the pros and cons of the various warbands. If GW then decided to remove Reaper and instead replace it with a treasure mission, the meta would shift massively. Suddenly the game is less about killing, although that's always going to be a factor, and we'd see movement become a lot more important. I'm labouring this a little bit though, but the key point here is we make our warband for the scenario, not the other way around. These are 2 sample packs GW have used, the Tangled Depths and Norwood Champion. In each case, 6 battle plans are presented. These have victory and deployment already combined to avoid any problematic combinations. The Tangled Depths use the match play missions from the rulebook, while Norwood Champion uses some of its own. Here are the missions from the Norwood Champion pack, which we'll focus on for the remainder of this video. While there are 6 in total, each event only has 3 games. This has pros and cons. We've narrowed down the variety to just 6, so the unbalanced scenarios have been removed. Players can prepare for the 6 games and try to have a plan ready, but they'll never be 100% sure what they're going to face, so they can't hyper specialize. On the downside, since the draw is random, you can end up with a tournament favouring one strategy heavily. Personally, I feel losing the variety and having fixed missions actually makes for a more competitive event. So the pack would just have 3 scenarios rather than the 6, and players would know they're going to play each scenario once, even if the order might be random. After we have our tournament back, we can start working on a warband. We need to look at a number of elements to determine what will give us our best chance of victory. First, we look at the terrain. Now, it's unlikely that detail of the terrain will actually be included in the pack. Typically, events will just cobble together whatever they can, and you'll have a number of different tables on the day. That might mean tables with terrain already set up, or scenery from the Warcry boxes, along with a deck of terrain cards to randomize it. Both approaches have their own problems, especially when combinations of terrain and objectives clash. For example, if you have mounted troops and there is no terrain to climb on, then you don't have to worry about the drawback of cavalry. A table with lots of platforms, on the other hand, along with treasure or objectives, could make mounted fighters a real liability. Similarly, a lot of blocking terrain will reduce the effectiveness of ranged fighters, while an open board will improve it. Of particular interest in the current meta is how much room you have to place monsters. If a board is relatively open, then a monster will have free reign to rampage across the board. but if there's a lot of terrain, the monster might not be able to fit and will end up out of the action. In theory, you're only really limited by your imagination when it comes to the victory conditions. They aren't baked into the rules, so an event organizer could come along with anything they think is fun and write a scenario for it. In practice, the main victory conditions can be lumped into three categories: treasure, objectives, and kill. For those conditions, you will find certain fighters are better. Speed has always been king, and being able to get in and get out with treasure can be game winning. You also need to look at who can actually hold treasure, so beasts are out as they can't even pick it up, but consider also who can take a few blows and still walk it off. The default rules for controlling an objective are to count the number of fighters within 3 inches, so having cheap fighters can be a big advantage. Some packs may adjust this to count points or total health, so keep an eye out for that. For kill-based missions, you're obviously taking fighters good at inflicting and soaking damage, but even without these types of mission, it's likely you'll be counting kill points as a tiebreaker. With this system, you keep a running total of the points of fighters you take down during the event. Looking over the victory conditions in this pack, we can see there are a lot of objective missions, 5 out of the 6, with the one remaining a treasure mission. So this pack is going to favour warbands that are better at controlling objectives. Whether that means lots of chaff fighters or just enough fighters that are hard to shift is up to you. As an extra quirk, the GERT Champion pack adds side quests. The side quests are a mix of treasure, objective, and kill options. They are randomly decided along with the scenario and given an additional way to score victory points. I have to admit, I'm not really a fan of these. As we talked about earlier, part of the goal in competitive play is to minimize random bias. Usually secondary objectives are something you'd select for a warband rather than having it randomly decided. This means that if the main objective is poor for you, you'll still have a backup that you're good at. This version essentially changes the 6 scenarios we've previously had into 36 different scenarios. While this doesn't necessarily introduce any unbalanced scenarios, it does mean you can get a more heavily biased event, where, for example, you draw 2 kill missions out of the 3, and your side quests are also kill focused. The next aspect to consider is deployment, and unfortunately I think this is an underutilized aspect of Warcry. In the current edition, we're pretty much always splitting our warband into 3 even groups without much consideration over which is which. That's because the deployments have intentionally been designed to be balanced, with each group getting an equal showing. When it comes down to the mechanics, there really isn't much of a difference between Warcry and Kill Team, which is considered a very competitive game. The big difference that I can see between the games is battle groups in Warcry, which are great for getting you into the action, but end up being random because you can't actually plan for them. If we look at the Norwood Champion pack, we can see the hammer starting turn 1 in the 2 battle plan on the left. Then in the middle we have 2 shields turn 1, and on the right we have 2 daggers turn 1. So when it comes to splitting your groups, it's pretty much even based on which starts turn 1. If you want to go into more detail, you can certainly consider distance and objectives, and perhaps tailor your group to be better at a particular scenario. I've already mentioned the potential problems of having 6 victory conditions and only playing 3, and that's the same for deployment groups. You can end up with a situation where the hammer group starts 2 out of the 3 games, giving players with strong hammers an advantage. In my personal opinion, a better approach is to have the scenario defined ahead of time so players can adjust their groups to favour one particular game over another. Obviously, an important consideration when going into an event is what the current meta looks like, both the greater hypothetical meta of whatever YouTube channel has produced a tier list for, and the very local meta of what your local players love to play. As a tournament organizer, you can have some impact on this, selecting certain scenarios that will favour certain archetypes. Often that's something you want to try to avoid, but sometimes it can be fun for everyone to shake it up, especially if a certain warband is consistently winning. As a player, you'll want to consider what you can take to give you an edge on the assumption your local players don't pull any surprises. That might be a simple tuning of your current warband to favour damage versus T5 targets, or it could mean coming up with something from scratch, develop the perfect meta warband. Last up, I'd like to talk about monsters. Up until now, we've been kind of talking about the abstract, about structuring an event and considerations when playing in one. This is a little bit more current meta. If you've been paying attention to recent Warcry tournaments, you'll be aware that monsters have been making a big impact. Due to this, it's a good idea to understand how monsters work and consider whether you should play one for yourself or not. In a match playlist, you can have only one monster from your Grand Alliance. They took up an entire deployment slot by themselves and deploy within 3 inches of deployment, rather than wholly within, so they do get a decent push forward. Rather than having one activation with two actions, they get three activations, each with only one action. They cannot make reactions, and if they climb, their base must be wholly on the platform or they fall. There are a number of special abilities associated with monsters. All of your non-beast fighters get access to the monster hunting abilities, but honestly, they aren't really great. The monster has its own three abilities, of which one in particular you should be aware of. That's Dragon Ball. It'll let the monster move an enemy a considerable distance, since you can pick it up within the 6 inches and move it to the opposite side of your monster, and often that base is about 5 inches. Dragon Maul does do some decent damage, although often the monster will then use its next attack to just eat the target. This is something to be aware of, more than anything that needs to be changed. I've heard TOs declaring events monster free, but that's more to shake up the meta after running several tournaments where monsters eventually took over. As a player, you definitely should have a strategy on how to deal with a monster if you face one. So, what have we learned? This video was focused on competitive events rather than necessarily playing competitively. The two conversations have crossover for sure, but in this video I wanted to focus on tournament structure because I don't think we've fully broken away from the casual approach that we started with in the core box. Using the combined victory and deployment has definitely removed some of the more egregious combinations, but we still have the potential to skew an event heavily in one direction or another. To be fair, that's less of an issue with the Norwood Champion pack because the 6 scenarios already heavily skew towards objective-based missions. I also think we've got some untapped potential when it comes to deployments, specifically because the current ethos is to evenly balance these, which unfortunately removes any meaningful choice for the players. The perfect event for me will be one where we already know all the scenarios and get to fully tailor our lists for them. That way players can account for any bias in the setup while developing their warband strategy. So, is Warcry competitive? Definitely. You can tell because we're seeing similar style lists win events. Monsters and lots of cheap chaff, warbands that leverage the power of slow fighters with movement boosts like the Tempest Eye ability, undead warbands that just keep coming back. We're even beginning to see innovations like the Deathmaster plus Storm Vermin list that Salty Sea recently covered. Can it be better though? I definitely think so. All in all, Warcry is still a relatively new game, and I think to a certain extent it's been held back by how good the casual play is. The good news is, we don't need to actually change anything in the game to make it more competitive. All we need to do is tighten up the tournament packs and give players actual decisions to be made by actually showing the scenarios ahead of time. Hopefully that's something we'll eventually see coming from GW themselves, but it's also something that you can start doing in your local scene to encourage other players to enjoy the competitive side of Warcry. Thanks for making it all the way to the end. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Each week I put up a new video talking about one of Games Workshop's specialist games. The goal is always to try and make the best possible two-player experience. If this is something you'd find interesting, please subscribe to the channel and comment to let me know what you'd like to see in future.